problems. And problems between languages are there in all kinds of text, whether they are epic poems, tourist brochures, legal texts, instruction manuals, all kinds of texts. There is a need to resolve problems. And I found when I first came across functionalist theory years ago, particularly as promoted by Katharina Reiss and Hans Vermeer, I found this enormously interesting, very, very useful, and applicable also to literary texts. Because the whole basis of Skopos theory is simply to just be mindful of the purpose for which the translation is being undertaken, and then to make those linguistic selections that appear most appropriate. The translator has to take responsibility, and taking responsibility for a text, whether it's a translation of a business letter, a newspaper report on a football game, or a recipe, or whatever, involves a freedom on the part of the translator to reshape accordingly. And I did find Jan Pedersen's lecture yesterday morning on the importance of the human in machine translation very relevant here. My interest is in literary translation. Also, as I think, Ivana, you mentioned this morning, I have done a lot of judging of international literary prizes in the last 20 years. And I found that a fascinating process in terms of thinking about translators' creativity. For many years, I was one of the judges on the Spender Poetry and Translation Prize. And I noticed that what the texts that we awarded the prizes to tended to be the ones that took the greatest risks. Risks included taking a 19th century Italian dialect poet and translating him into Scots, or translating short Greek epigrams into text messages, or transforming the Latin poet Catullus into a contemporary rap artist. In other words, exercising a freedom to be, as I quoted this morning, Anne Carson, to crazy things up a bit. But also this morning I referred to the instability of the original with earlier texts, and my argument here is that, in a sense, the older the text, the more textual manipulation it has gone through with multiple hands, and therefore the more creative a translator needs to be. And in that very helpful document that you sent round to prepare for the discussion, when you asked us to say something for 5 minutes, I took up some of the questions, and one of those questions was whether the binary model of source and target has become obsolete. And I think it was always inadequate, except perhaps, and again I said this morning, as a pedagogical tool for the teaching of a foreign language. And also, can we talk about boundaries? That is, when is a translation not a translation? When does it become an adaptation? Well, I don't find this helpful at all. The basic criterion in theatre translation, when people talk about the difference between an adaptation and a translation, seems to be the distance perceivable in the freedom of the translator that a text has gone from its source, and I don't find that helpful. I was very interested in your notes about the question of translating small languages, and I'm glad you use small languages and not minority or minor languages, which I think tends to be rather offensive. But referring back to the Women Writers in Translation Prize, which I've now judged, I'm judging it at the moment, I've got a box of books I'm still finishing. This is the 5th year, and we can see something quite interesting here, which is not only a number of small publishers willing to take risks, but an interesting number of prize-winning entries from small languages. In the first year of the prize, we awarded it to Yoko Tawada, who is the Japanese-German writer. The second year, it went to a Croatian writer. And last year, it went to a Georgian writer. The only bigger language was French. We awarded it to a French author in 2019. But I looked through and I was looking through which languages are represented. And in our short list, that is the ones we actually considered for the prize, we had Georgian, 2 Finnish, 3 Hungarian, 3 Korean, 5 Polish, Russian, Sudanese. So a big range of very, very interesting works written in small languages. I think that when we are thinking about creativity, we also have to take into account the unpredictability and what I call the randomness of translation success. Because, well, the Elena Ferrante phenomenon, for example, I think is a classic example of this. I read those 4 books in Italian and I thought, these will never work in English. Just culturally too tied to the context, to the Italian context. And I was wrong. And there are endless examples where writers who one assumes will be hugely successful have not been successful at all in the target culture. And in other cases, and not just Elena Ferrante, I would cite the famous J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter, or the Brazilian Paulo Coelho, who's become an international bestseller, a global phenomenon. Both of those are writers that were pretty well ignored when they first came out. So I think we need to think about these factors, the unpredictability factor, which has everything to do really with how readers read, and thankfully cuts across the marketing process. That's all I'm going to say. I will hand over to colleagues.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think you have opened quite a few topics we'll be discussing further. So could I ask Professor Venuti to say a few words about creativity as he sees it, as you see it?
Thank you. Yeah, I prepared a short text to make sure I say everything within the time slot. Some of this overlaps with ideas in my paper, so forgive the repetition. Consider it as a way to clarify points. But inevitably, I'm going to be developing things in my talk. Anything said about translation always assumes a concept of what translation is. And the fact is that not every concept can disclose in a comprehensive and incisive way the nature of the translator's creativity. Consider that concept of translation that I've been discussing, a concept that has long dominated the history of translation theory and commentary throughout the world, right down to the present. I've been calling it instrumentalism. It understands translation as the reproduction or transfer of an invariant contained in or caused by the source text, an invariant form, meaning, or effect. Here, it would seem that the translator's creativity lies not in perceiving the source text invariant. That cognitive ability would constitute basic competence, but rather in choosing or developing a form, meaning, or effect in the translating language that exactly matches that source text invariant. I say choosing or developing because the corresponding form, meaning, or effect may not pre-exist the translation process in the translating language. It may have to be constructed somehow. Hence, instrumentalism imagines the translator's creativity as a certain resourcefulness, the results of which are evaluated as to correctness or accuracy against the source text invariant. To be creative in translation, then, is to get the source text right in these terms. Yet, just how creative is getting it right? Doesn't an instrumental model of translation essentially reduce the translator's labor to mechanical substitution? Translation here is largely a matter of replacing one word by one word, whereby a formal semantic or affective invariant in the source text is believed to be preserved intact during the translation process. That is to say, reproduced or transferred so that it's communicated or signified in the translated text. We can call this process one that requires resourcefulness, but finally that seems to be a misnomer, since by mechanical I mean that a machine can do it, properly programmed. To discover a way out of this quagmire, we must acknowledge that instrumentalism carries an egregious corollary. This is the empiricist assumption that the invariant is simply available to perception without the translator's construction or interpretation. The invariant, however, is in fact an interpretation. You may, of course, object by insisting that source text words have stable, inherent grammatical features and meanings, so that the translator need only perceive them to locate formal, semantic, or affective invariants. But this objection doesn't stand up. Why not? Merely by choosing the word as the unit of translation, the translator has already initiated the process of constructing the so-called invariant, since many different units of translation are possible. Not only the word, but the phrase, sentence, paragraph, section, or chapter, right up to the entire text. And the choice of a specific unit will inevitably affect how the translator construes grammar and meaning at a lower or smaller level in the scale of units. Moving between languages, furthermore, releases the possibility of synonymy, where similarity in meaning cannot be treated as identity, pointing to the fact that meaning in language is ultimately determined by context. Translation builds a context for the source text in a different language and culture, so that differences in form, meaning, and effect are inevitable, even when the translator struggles to establish a semantic correspondence and stylistic approximation, not so much to the source text itself as to the translator's understanding of the source text. The invariant, then, does not exist as a readily perceptible essence residing in any text, since any text is never available in some direct, unmediated way, but is always already processed or interpreted. To reveal the translator's creativity, we need a concept of translation that is fundamentally hermeneutic. Translation can be understood as an interpretive act that inevitably varies source text form, meaning, and effect according to intelligibilities and interests in the receiving culture. The translator applies interpretive factors drawn from cultural forms and practices that are arranged in a hierarchy of authority or prestige in the receiving situation. An interpretation is inscribed in the source text through linguistic patterns, cultural traditions, translation conventions, through styles, genres, and discourses of specific media, which enable the translation to support meanings, values, and functions. This interpretive act reveals translation at its most creative because any source text can support the construction of multiple and conflicting interpretations. The institutions in and through which translations are produced and circulated delimit a range of acceptable interpretations, even as those institutions try to control how the translations themselves are received or interpreted. Translation of any kind of text, whether humanistic, pragmatic, or technical, should be seen as creative precisely because it has the potential to be a powerful act of interpretation, depending, of course, on the translator's inventiveness in construing verbal choices as interpretive moves. Here's an example. It's offered by Darcy Paquette's English subtitles for Bong Joon-ho's 2019 film Parasite. An instrumentalist model might fault Paquette's translation at 2 points. where it deviates from specific words on the Korean soundtrack. Thus, Paquette changes a reference to Seoul National University to Oxford in a scene where the Kim family fabricates a resume to secure a lucrative job. Paquette also replaces an obscure Korean word for a beef noodle dish with ramdan, hyphenated, ramdan. This is a neologism formed from two Japanese words, ramen and udon. From a hermeneutic point of view, Paquette's choices are not errors. They rather point to the cultural domination that Korea has suffered since the beginning of the 20th century by indicating the character's fascination with Anglophone and Japanese cultures as repositories of cultural resources that are perceived as valuable and therefore worthy of imitation. This fascination is represented in the film by the wealthy Park family, whom the impoverished Kim family exploit to improve their own financial situation. Paquette's verbal choices, in other words, are inventive interpretive moves that open up the post-colonial discourse in the film. I'll stop here. Thank you.
So I guess many of us have seen the film. Maybe there will be discussion about that as well. Okay, so now I would like to ask Jan Pedersen to say a few words.
Well, thank you. I'd like to say a few words and then I'd like to show a few slides because I'm quite the opposite of Susan because I can't really talk without a PowerPoint presentation. Anyway, I agree with the previous speakers on a couple of points. I agreed with Larry that I don't find those translation solutions to be errors either. I think there are indeed interpretations that could validly be done in the subtitles of Parasite. But most of all, I agree with Susan when I say that all translation is creative. But I would also add a caveat here. All human translation is creative. There was a speaker yesterday who showed a machine translation result which was very different from the original and they had no direct link, and he called this creative. And I'm guessing he was ironic, but my notion of creativity involves intent and intentionality, and machines and algorithms cannot have intentions, so machines cannot, in my mind, be creative. So I would hedge Susan's statement there and say that all human translation is creative. Can we show my slides now, please? Thank you. So, a little bit of background, because I work mainly in subtitling, as you know. There is a big discussion about creative subtitles these days, because with improved technology, a lot of text on screen is being produced in source text in films, and I'll show you some examples. And also in the translation process, some subtitles now appear at various places and interact with the source text in very interesting and fascinating way. And the common nomer for that is creative subtitles. And I'll show you some examples here. For instance, from TV series Sherlock, where the text messages appear on screen in a very snazzy way. We have this business letter being constructed in subtitles, but as a business letter, which I think is a very nice touch. We have dream sequences, and where the subtitles appear in the mist, and we have various other forms of creative use of subtitles. And I do agree that they're creative, and I think that they're very interesting use of text on the screen, and it's the interaction with the other semiotic channels on screen I think is very fascinating. What I do mind is the term for them, to call them creative subtitles, because if these are subtitles, then what are these? I'll show you some examples of subtitles created by traditional subtitlers, to mainly comedy shows, because that gives a bit more leeway of freer translation, if you will, or more strongly marked hermeneutic efforts, or what have you. If you remember the TV series Monty Python, there was many weird sketches there, and in this text we see a picture of some some industry. It's trouble at the mill sort of thing. And the sign says Jarrow 1912. And the Danish subtitle of that says just see above. So the subtitler interacts with the source text saying it's the same as above. You can just look there. And so they direct the struggle. But still, these are traditional subtitles. But I think this is a very creative way of doing a subtitle. And further on in the sketch, he comes to say, there's trouble at the mill. And then he says something like, one of the flare rods went out and swallowed on the quiddle. And she doesn't understand what he's saying. And the Danish subtitler has translated that into mumbling, and it's also even in dialects. So instead of reproducing the message, and the sketch shows that the message is nonsense, basically. Nobody understands what he's saying. So instead they have focused on the style of the production and done that interpretation of it. And just to show that it's not just the Danes that can be creative, I'll show you a Swedish example as well. Oh, right, I even had a sound for that. Let's see if we can hear it. Sorry. No, it won't work. Well, I can play it.
One of crossbeams gone out askew on treadle.
Did you get it? No, of course not. Anyway, in the TV series Little Britain, there is this character called Vicky Pollard who speaks very quickly and very nonsensically. And she gets the question of, did you bite Susan? She's called to the principal and asked if she bit Susan, and she says this.
God, it's like this film I saw once where this woman goes into this place and sells fin happens, and all other fin happens, then the video cut off. Anyway, Rachel said that Denise done it with her brother.
So this is extremely quick, and as the reply to the question, did you bite Susan, is completely irrelevant, right? It has nothing to do with the question at all. Instead, it's just a way of reproducing this stereotype of the basic Essex girl and how she's stupid and talking really quickly and so on. Now, the Swedish public service broadcaster translated this into the subtitles, or interpreted this
God, it's
this
like
way.
this film I saw once where this woman goes into this place and sells fin happens, and all other fin happens, then the video cut off. Anyway, Rachel said that Denise done it with her brother.
There you got it again. Anyway. Det här är typ som en video jag sett av Denise gjort med sin brorsa. You don't speak Swedish, I forgot about that. Well, I do have a back translation for you. This is like a video I've seen, and Denise done it with her brother. So most of what she says actually goes out the way, but by writing the subtitle in this way, they create a new meaning which is more related to the way that she says stuff rather than what she says. So what I'd like to claim then is that these are indeed very creative subtitles too. So I think talking about creative subtitles as being a subset of subtitles just because the way they interact with the source text is perhaps wrong. And I think that creativity is a continuum. If you go from totally weird stuff that we've seen here, things that are, to use Susan's terms, crazied up, we have things that are sort of very expressing more, very much less creativity, all the way to machine translation, which I will then contest has none. So I think that creativity requires intent, and therefore some colleagues and I have indeed, in fact, suggested the term free-form subtitles for the first ones that you see, because it's mainly the question of how they interact with the source text and where they are placed and what fonts they have and how cute they look and so on. So I think free-form subtitles would be better, because my contention then is that all forms of subtitling is in fact creative. Thank you. That's weird word again. Dziękuję.
Děkujeme i my. Thank you very much as well from our side and my side. Okay, so there have been quite a few topics outlined in these three opening statements. And I would like to continue with the question that was already hinted at by Susan. And it's the binary of source and target text. Maybe I can give a brief background. It is creativity that enables a literary translator to carry an untranslatable, air quotes, text over the boundaries of its cultural and cognitive domain. Innovative writing often employs translation as one of its procedures, or handles the foreign text as a source of creative material. But when investigated very closely, even exemplars of what we could call a prototypical literary translation or original writing contain procedures that dilute the illusion that writing a text and translating a text are two radically different activities. So as has already been stated by Susan Bassnett, there are people who would agree with that. I have a set of sub-questions or things that spring into one's mind while thinking about these things. Has the basic binary model of source and target, text and culture, become obsolete? Can it serve, for example, as an explanatory model in education, in teaching? What is the character of the concepts of source and target text in translation as a creative act in the 21st century? Where in the practices that combine translation and non-translational procedures are the boundaries between a translation and a new text? Is it even necessary or productive to insist on these boundaries? Would a more radical abolishing of the boundaries between translated and non-translated text and source and target text in any way threaten translation studies as a field? So Professor Bassnett has already expressed her view on this. The boundary, in your opinion, is not something really stable or existent. Is that true?
Yeah, I don't think it's particularly helpful, though, and I did say this morning in my talk, with apologies to Larry who won't have heard it. It can be useful, I think, as a pedagogical tool. That is, you can, in using a binary model, you can actually not only, it can not only assist with the teaching of a foreign language, but it can also, I think, assist with the teaching of translation. And this is one of the reasons why I like to workshop translations, and I like also to give my students a range of different possibilities, because when you show the possibilities inherent in translating a text, you immediately see how that kind of the binary distinctions start to dissolve. So I don't think, certainly for literary translation, I don't think a binary model is helpful at all.
Thank you. As we're preparing for this roundtable, we're discussing some of the topics with Jan before we started, and Jan expressed a different opinion.
Well, sort of. I prefer to say that it's a perhaps more nuanced opinion, because I think it's useful in the way that you say, Susan, for teaching purposes, both in languages and in translation. But also, I think, a binary opposition is not a very good way of seeing it. I think we need to have a more nuanced and pluralistic view of source texts and target texts. But I'd also like to strongly state that they are different texts. The source text and the target text are different texts. It's not. I would like to claim that a translation can never change a source text, because the source text is still there, and the target text is then created as a different text. So the source text is still untouched by the translation. The only way in which a translation or a target text can change a source text is that if a reader comes to a source text after having read the target text, his or her mind may be affected by the translation that she or he has read. But that is not a change in the source text itself. It's a change in the way that the reader sees the source text. It's not a change in the text itself, I would say. And then, of course, there are many different levels of source text and target text. And as I showed yesterday with the flowcharts of the many different source text versions that are involved in subtitling, for instance. And also, there are, as has been pointed out, that the source texts aren't really stable over time anyway, and target texts can be worked upon in very many ways, and also some target texts don't even have source texts, like for pseudo translations, for instance. So I think it's a complicated issue, but I think we need some sort of common ground. So for that purpose, I think it's useful to I would keep the thing because I think it's useful, but I think we need to problematize it and make people aware of it.
Thank you. Would some of you like to react to this? Because I do have a reaction, in fact. Because you said that the source text is not changed by the fact that it is translated. But it probably depends on the definition of the source text. If reception is part of the source text as well. I mean, for example, when you have these small cultures and the text is translated into a large language, the source text changes its status. It becomes more important, canonical, or worthwhile. But that's just a remark from my.
Well, I agree that the status of the source text will change, but the source text itself will remain the same.
Thank you. Professor Venuti, do you want to add something to this?
2 points.
Yeah.
This is to respond to Jan and then to take up Susan's very important point, I think. The idea of distinguishing between the source text and its status, as Jan just did in response to Ivana's comment, I don't know what that gets us to say that the source text, hasn't changed, insofar as the source text is only available to us through mediations, through interpretations. So yes, we could say that the words on the page of the source text, say the same. Copyright law, if it's still under copyright, will ensure that it gets, copied in that way. But translation does materially change the status of text. Pascal Casanova's marvelous work about translation as a consecration of source languages, source texts, source literatures is a key example here of the way translation, has such power. But we're not going to see that until we recognize that the source text, of course, can go on and exist as the words on the page, but it's the way it's understood, the way it's interpreted, the way it's processed that ultimately matters, whether that is translation or forms of interpretation or whatever. Even the way it's typeset can affect the meaning and the form of the source text. So that's one point. The other point, this idea of the binary opposition between source text and translation, just to add, to what's been said about this. I mean, one thing I think we need to realize is that to depart from this, movement from the source text to the translation that is so deeply embedded in the way we understand translation, even in among translators. What we're talking about here and trying to rethink this is different ways of reading translations. That it's possible, in other words, and I've argued this in various ways, to look at the relationship between a source text and a translation as a critical dialectic, where the translation, does things to the source text, things of which the source text were unaware, in fact. But the source text can also come back and do things to the translation, to worry about the translation, to start thinking about the relationship between the translation and the source text as a critical dialectic. We need to think about the ways we interpret, these texts. The translator will always sit before a source text. So there's a sense in which, just in pragmatic ontological terms, there is this opposition. However, when we have a translation, we can choose to read it in this dialectical way, as doing something to the source text, even as the source text can be shown to be doing things to the translation. Articulating how this dialect works depends on, of course, a reader who brings in a third category to set going this critical dialectic. But we're not there yet. And certainly translators don't read their work in these ways. Okay, I'll stop right there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Would you like to react, Jan, or?
Oh, I'm good.
Yeah. Okay, so since this conference is more concerned with the human versus machine, let's say, technologies, etc., we might want to address that as well. Many have argued that instead of taking a strict critical stance towards this trend, technologies playing an increasingly more and more important role in our lives and in translation as well, that translation studies and translation practice and products should look for ways to cooperate with phenomena like artificial intelligence, to insert, let's say, poetry and human sensitivity into the machine. Like we see poetry books written by neural networks, and the idea behind these practices are not to replace the human writer, but to humanize the machine. At least that's what the authors I'm thinking about expressed. So do you see this transdisciplinary and intermediate dialogue between natural sciences, technologies on the one hand, and human-centered fields as something that can alleviate the detrimental effects of technologizing the human world, or the world? So I would like to...
Yes.
Jan?
No, I definitely think so, because there's too little dialogue, I think, between the technological people and the machines and the humanists who have to use the machines. So, and that is why we entered the risk of, as I was saying yesterday, that the humans become used by the machines instead of using the machines. So there needs to be a dialogue with the developers of software and of the machines, and also of what it means to translate, because the notions that technology people or natural science people have of translation is very different from the many and various forms of definitions and understandings of translation that translators and humanists have. So I think that there is so much to be gained from a dialogue all the way through, from the very beginning, to understand the concepts and also to understand the needs of the translators and also the need of the viewers and readers.
Thank you.
Yeah, can I come in?
Yes,
Yes,
please.
thank you. This is actually, I think it's an important point, because first of all, as I pointed out today, by not using PowerPoint, I also admit to being what I call technologically semi-literate, not illiterate totally, but semi-literate. And during the 18 months of the pandemic, I've given a lot of consideration to this, because clearly we are all finding ourselves using technology in ways that we couldn't have imagined 2 years ago. Maybe you could, Jan, but for people like myself, I think, and if I can speak for Larry as well, we have been forced to rethink our relationship with technology as a means of communication. And one of the things that I'm very aware of, though, is that it's very difficult to generalize, because there are enormous generational differences in technological awareness. And I think those generational differences are barely at the beginning. We have a generation. If I think of my grandsons, for example, and my granddaughter, their use of technology in the classroom, the use of computers in the classroom, the way they think is different to the way their parents, my children, think, and their way is different to the way I think. So I do think that there is a need. I think there is a need for much greater dialogue, but I think also that we need to take into account that we are also witnessing a massive, massive generational transformation. And that is even more acute in some cultures than in others. And then I think, in addition to that, it is hugely important in the dialogue that we take into account. I mean, I always used to, with my students in the, let's call it the age of the book, I used to draw attention to the way in which text, written texts, whether they are novels, whether they are newspapers, whatever they are, manipulate the readers. I think that question of manipulation, of, if I'm going to go extreme, one could almost say brainwashing, is more significant now than it's ever been, particularly for a generation that may not read books, may get their news entirely from the media. And of course, one of the ongoing debates, I think, in so many parts of the world now is over the nefarious impact of social media. Again, something that has been heightened during the pandemic. So I think all these issues are kind of floating around in a sort of vast soup at the moment. And there is most definitely the need for a lot more dialogue about the role of machines and the human.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Professor Venuti, would you like to address this question as well?
Absolutely. Can I go back to my PowerPoint? Is that possible?
We'll see. It seems like it is.
I see Professor Venuti has a much fancier gadget in his hand than I have.
Well, it's not an iPhone.
No.
It's a lower. Okay, there it goes. A lower degree of smartness. Let me begin with a confession. I use Google Translate, and I happen to be translating a novel right now. It's also a retranslation, and I find myself using Google Translate as well as online dictionaries on a regular basis. And Google Translate, has been helpful. I'm translating a novel from Italian to English, and it happens to be actually a very famous novel. This is only the second time it's been translated. The first time was in 1952, so it's been 70 years since this novel has been translated. And I realize you're probably waiting for me to tell you who the author is and the title and so forth. It's Dino Buzzati's novel, Il Deserto dei Tartari, which
Fantastic.
which was translated. I'm so excited to be doing this. I have to tell you, Susan.
Yes.
It was translated for the first and only time in 1952 by Stuart Hood, a distinguished Scottish translator, under the title "The Tartar Steppe." I'm changing the title, but Buzzati wrote his novel in the 1930s. And one of the things about it is that the syntax of some of his sentences is so strange from the vantage point of contemporary Italian, or let's just say later Italian generally, that it sometimes helps to feed a sentence into Google Translate to get a sense of how the syntax is working. And, as a translator, I just use, electronic databases. But to go back to my, yes, this is a rough sketch of what a hermeneutic model would look like. And I put this up because I want to show what technology is currently unable to do. So I want to draw some lines here. Although I see myself as dependent on technology, especially during the pandemic, when libraries were closed and et cetera, and I found myself relying on online resources to a tremendous extent, it struck me that the interpretive act in translation, as I try to sketch it here, is not something that technology is yet able to perform. So I'm drawing lines once again. I'm looking at translation as a process where there are three categories. To move from a source text to a translation, the translator must apply a very, very complicated set of interpretive factors that I'm calling interpretants in yellow on this. There are different kinds of interpretants. These distinctions between formal and thematic are not hard and fast. I'm really just trying to, clarify, what's at stake here. But these are the kinds of things machines are unable to perform at this point. This model, at the same time, needs to be localized, needs to be located in a specific cultural situation, a target, a translating cultural situation. And in terms of the hierarchy of forms and practices and media in that situation, those are the sources for the translator's interpretants. Again, Google Translate is marvelous because one of the things it does is measure words, phrases, sentences, paragraphs against a huge database, electronic database of texts. It's matching according to algorithms, and it does it in a remarkably efficient way. Many texts still need to be edited, but what Google Translate cannot do is think about the application of interpretants in specific cultural situations at specific historical moments. I think that's essential. All of this, let me add, to take up some issues that are on the table, can be considered intended action by the translator. So this is where the creativity applies. There are many concepts of equivalence, but a concept of equivalence is central to translation. It determines what is a translation. Without establishing a structural relationship to the source text, which is the way I'm defining equivalence here, there is no translation. We need to have that relationship. At the same time, there are things of which translators are unaware. There are conditions that the translator cannot acknowledge because the translator doesn't know them. You can consider these translations linguistic, cultural, political, whatever, but they are there when translators are translating. The translator can sometimes intends to address these conditions, but not always, I think. Yet, they can be considered the unconscious of the translation act. At the same time, every human action, including translation, has unanticipated consequences. Susan talked about the unpredictability of translation. Well, the translator cannot control responses to the translation. Publication of any book today is often like a message in the bottle. You don't know who's waiting out there to read that message, and you can't control how they're going to read it, what they bring to the processing of that message. So another unintended, unconscious aspect of translation. If anything, I think what technology has done for us is impress on us how important it is to imagine concepts of human agency that allow for the full complexity of human behavior. a complexity that machines can't perform yet. Yes, there is intended action. There is a kind of reflexive self-monitoring that humans submit their actions, their intentions to. But there's also what escapes intentionality. There can be very creative translations then, I would argue, for which the translator cannot account. Especially today, when the division between translation theory and translation practice is still apparently insurmountable, regardless of whether the translator is coming out of a translator training program or just holed up in some attic with a dictionary translating, that translators still have trouble mediating between theory and practice. So much of what they say about their practice in interviews tends not to be very sophisticated. And you wonder, where is this translator's intention? They have trouble accounting for their attention or providing even a record of an intention. And then, of course, and I'll end with this for now, there is the problem that a record of a translator's intention is one thing, and then there is the translation, which is another thing. And as Nietzsche might say, the wheel of causality doesn't necessarily roll between them. So technology is useful, but given the way I want to imagine the translator's agency, I think technology, I don't know, get me a programmer I can have a dialogue with.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Even before you started speaking, Jan wanted to note something. And we have some questions on Slido. I think we're like...
Well, I'm going to use the fact that I'm actually here and can influence the moderator. Now, I'd just like to point out that even though I said that machine translation cannot be creative, it doesn't mean that machine translation cannot be used creatively by... So, Larry, when you showed Solus that you used Google Translate, doesn't mean that your translation isn't creative just because you used that tool. I mean, there were people who probably were very much against using quills and ink and stuff and what's wrong with stone tablets and stuff. So we don't want to be Luddites in this. I just want to say, again, that I think it's important that the users are involved in the process of producing the machines and the software. And it's very similar to what we see in media accessibility these days, where groups of people with various disabilities insist on being involved in the processes that lead to the accessibility for them under the slogan of nothing about us without us. So disabled people insist on having a say in the accessibility that is created for them. And I think that translators as well should make their voices heard and insist that they are involved in the processes that create the tools that they will use. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I might want to move on to some Slido questions from the audience, since we only are left with 17 minutes, as the counter says. So if machines are using the humans in translation and not vice versa, and this is actually enabled by humans, can a dialogue help? Is there a real interest? So I don't know.
I'm sure there's an interest from the translator's point of view and from the human point of view, certainly. And that is, I mean, the machine isn't the enemy here, and the machine isn't the overlord. I know I may make it sound like the machine is the overlord, but that's in fact not at all true. I mean, it's the process that is the overlord, and which reduces humans to be used by machines, so to speak. So this is more like a metonymy than anything else. So we need translators to have a say in how they use the translation machines, is basically what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Would anyone else like to react to that question? Is there interest? Maybe we should ask some IT people. No?
No, I just agree with what's been said, with Jan's point. Yeah.
Okay. So there's
I mean,
actually...
I would add,
Yep.
if I may, that Susan's point about social media, I mean, we should not forget this,
No.
that Facebook, Instagram, and so forth, that talk about unpredictability. I mean, these forms of media are out of control entirely and have the power to create alternative it's that of course is a euphemism, alternative reality, given the kind of political problems that have emerged in the US in the wake of the recent presidential elections. And I'm not going to give you a litany of my miseries as a New Yorker who looks at the rest of the US and sees it controlled in a fundamentally devastating way by social media. One of the questions I think that comes up is, how can social media be used to advance translation, thinking about translation? Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be happening yet, even though on Facebook, Instagram, and so forth, there's a lot of chatter about translation. There are entire chat groups devoted to translation. But I fear that social media, the very form that it takes, discourages, incisive thinking. And for many people who use it in relation to translation, it often becomes a kind of, not a critical medium. It has the potential to be really critical instead of just reiterating, concepts, ideas, responses that, proliferate. This is one of the problems with social media, this kind of uncontrollable proliferation. So it's one of the nightmares that we live through today, even if, as the more utopian among us, hope for a time when it can be harnessed to really advance the thinking about and practice of translation.
Thank you. Thank you. I had a few ideas springing into my mind while Professor Venuti was talking, but maybe someone else would like to react to that, or social media and translation. I was just thinking about global voices and about subtitling YouTube videos from conflict zones and social media revolution, and that these might not be connected with the platform is a platform and it's it determines the way we think, but there are also things connected with translation that that are useful.
I quite agree, Ivana, and I don't think there's such great need for gloom as may have been pointed out here, because there are good things as well, as you say, citizen activism and subtitled videos coming out of conflict zones and so on that are spread on social media, and so there are good things as well. So we needn't focus only on the bad parts, I think.
That's just a remark, but we do have more questions from the audience. Could we say that machine translation can enable us to focus more on creative, interpretive parts of translation work?
Yes. That's the short answer. But as I said yesterday, I think there's need for more flexibility. If the machines can go on with just the static communication, with the instructions, with the terms and conditions and so on, or and if translators can pick and choose, having stretches of text that don't require that much thought and then be more focused on the creative parts, I think that would be a very useful way of using the machines.
Okay, anyone else? Well, I mean, Professor Venuti has already explained how he uses Google Translate, and he can be creative and focus on other areas in his translation. Okay, maybe I can ask one of my questions that would this one would concern translation studies and creativity in translation studies. Creativity is not only a crucial element in translation practice, but also a tool for furthering research. As Susan Bassnett and David Johnston have recently pointed out, there is a lack of original thinking in many conferences dedicated to translation. This prevents the discipline from being able to enter wider transdisciplinary discussions that have the ability to address the pressing crisis faced by the planet, and also maybe prevents these transdisciplinary dialogues, perhaps. So my question would be, can this impasse be overcome? What tools should we use to reinsert creativity into translation studies and teaching translation?
That's a huge question. I think one of the part of the thinking behind the special issue of the journal, The Outward Turn, that David and I co-edited, part of the thinking there was, yes, the way in which the enormous spread of translation studies around the world, with many of the lines being blurred between what I would call translator training and translation history and translation theory. One of the things that we'd all noticed, and Larry, you and I have had this conversation as well, in usually over dinners in different places, that there has seemed to be a tendency on the part of some people working in translation studies to talk only to one another, to use a code that is only comprehensible to one another. And I think if you believe, as I do very firmly, that translation is crucially important, not only in today's world, but always has been, in terms of enabling communication across cultures. The whole history of literature, I would argue, is a history of translation. Then I think it's problematic that much of the value of thinking about in translation studies is not finding its way out into other disciplines. And that, I think, was our starting point. How, to what extent have people working in translation studies been speaking more to one another than getting out and speaking to other related disciplines? That was the point I think we were trying to make. And the two of us are now co-editing another volume for Routledge, which is simply entitled Debates on Translation. And we're expecting a number of those essays to be coming in the next 2 months. Current debates on translation, and a number of the issues that we're talking about here will in fact be featuring in the essays that we've commissioned.
Oh, I'm really looking forward to that one. So should be out this year, next year? Next year, I guess.
We're due to submit it by the end of May next year. So with any luck, it could be out by the end of 2022.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Professor Venuti, would you like to react?
I want to second what Susan, has just said, and give it a somewhat different spin to it. I mean, I think one of the problems facing translation research and practice is just as Susan has suggested, that there isn't a field or discipline or area in the full gamut of the arts and the human sciences that is not dependent on some form of translation, some second order practice that can be construed as a variety of translation. Yet, when you look at these fields, disciplines, and areas, you find very little discussion of translation. You find very few academic appointments filled by scholars who are interested in translation research or, in fact, in translating. And I wonder if in translation studies we haven't been, hamstringing our own interests or simply ignoring them by not speaking to members of these other fields, areas and disciplines, which I think is where translation scholars and translators should be publishing about translation. Put another way, the debate that emerges from time to time about whether translation studies should limit itself to ideas coming from translation studies or look to other fields, areas, and disciplines. That strikes me as a false distinction. Translation studies is something that has always moved between disciplines from antiquity on, and translation scholars and translators need to be in dialogue with the people who are using translations, the people who stand to benefit from translation research and practice. Having said this, I also think that it's essential to begin, it hasn't happened yet, to rethink curricula in translation studies and translator training, where, once again, I've already mentioned this, the whole relationship between translation research, translation theory, translation history on the one hand, and translation practice on the other, that connection is just not being explored enough. So translator training programs are producing professional translators, en masse. But these professional translators are not looking at what they're doing necessarily in terms that are important, not simply for their practice, but for bringing their practice in an intelligible way to the people who use it and who commission it and who study it. So it goes both ways here. I think also it's true that in some, say, literature programs, departments of anthropology, sociology, there is an approach to translation that tends to be very speculative, cut away from the practical decisions. And that, I think, needs to be examined. And I suppose what I'm saying fundamentally is that the relationship between theory and practice with translation is unique. That you can be a poetry critic without having any experience writing poems. Okay, you can be a restaurant reviewer without any experience cooking. Okay, but with translation, to have that connection with translation practice, to think of theoretical concepts, historical developments, traditions, conventions, in terms of practical moves by translators, in terms of translators' careers, in terms of how translators write and so forth. That is central, I think, to advancing, where thinking about translation and translation practice, currently is.
Thank you. Very much probably also depends on the specific country, region, and so on. But Professor Pedersen, would you like to add something?
Yes, I think it may also be field specific, because I honestly don't see it that way if coming from audiovisual translation. We're creatives as hell, I'd say, if you pardon the blasphemy there. I think but it may be that AVT studies is a younger field or something, but we are borrowing methodologies and working together with cognitivists and sociologists and anthropologists and media studies and ludologists and computer scientists and so on. So there's a lot going on between disciplines and also with user groups. So we have deaf people on our panels, we have blind people on our panel. I work myself very much with the audiovisual translators unions and so on. So we're reaching out to the practitioners, and I don't feel that there is such a great lack of creativity, at least not in audiovisual translation studies.
But I think you
If
also
I just,
have the,
yeah,
you
if
have
I
the
just add a rejoinder to that. Sorry, Susan. Just quickly, very quickly. The question then, Jan, becomes, where is translation? Where is audiovisual translation in the study of film and television? What are film scholars doing with translation studies? That's the kind of thing I mean. So everything you said is true. I would not, I certainly wouldn't dispute that. But when you look at the film scholars, I challenge you to come up with a list. How many film scholars are studying dubbing and subtitling, drawing on translation research or research they themselves do into, translation? Marcus Nurnes is one of the very few. A film scholar who is also a subtitler, works in East Asian at the University of Michigan, wrote a groundbreaking essay called For an Abusive Subtitling, where he immersed himself in translation studies. This was published in Film Quarterly, but an isolated thing. And then he wrote a book called Cinema Babel, which is all about translation in film. But he's a film scholar, Nurnes. So how many anthropologists are studying translation? How many historians? Those are the kinds of interdisciplinary connections I want to make. And it raises the question about whether, translation researchers should be speaking to these disciplines, whether the whole idea of setting oneself up as a specialist in translation studies might be short-circuiting the possibility for interdisciplinary research. That's a question. Okay. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Professor Bassnett, you wanted to add something?
I was just going to say that Jan has the, I think, advantage of working in and from a small language. And we have the disadvantage of being handicapped by English and by the problems of the Anglophone world in not being willing to talk openly about translation, and also not translating not nearly as much as you are translating in Sweden, in Denmark, in Slovakia. We are deeply handicapped by this, and I think some of our defensiveness comes from that awareness that this is the problem. Where you have a language that's considered a global means of communication, you have a lack of interest in translation, unfortunately. I'll end on that gloomy note.
Thank you. That's not a very, very optimistic thing to round up this roundtable.
It is for people in Slovakia.
Exactly, exactly. And it's Sweden.
Thank you for that. And thank you all very much for this extremely thought-provoking and inspiring discussion. I hope you had so much fun as I had. I was very happy and honored to be able to talk to you and have you. We all, the organizing team of Translation, Interpreting and Culture conference, were very honored you accepted our invitations, and thank you very much again. Thank you.
And thank you for being a brilliant.
Thank you for having me.
Thank
you. Yeah.